You don't decide to overthink. It begins before you're aware of it. A thought appears, then another, then a chain forms that feels impossible to interrupt. From the inside, it seems like you're actively thinking, analyzing, trying to figure something out. But the process doesn't feel optional. You don't sit down and choose to replay a conversation 10 times. You don't intentionally loop through possibilities until they lose meaning. It happens automatically, and what makes it confusing is that the content of the thoughts often feels important. It feels like something needs to be resolved. There's a sense that if you just think a little longer, you'll arrive at clarity. But that clarity never fully arrives. The loop continues, not because you haven't thought enough, but because the system generating the thoughts isn't designed to conclude. It's designed to continue. That distinction is easy to miss because the experience feels purposeful. It feels like effort directed toward a solution, but the effort is being driven by something else, something that does not require resolution to keep going. And once that process starts, it creates its own momentum. The longer it runs, the more convincing it feels. Not because it's getting closer to an answer, but because repetition increases the sense of importance. What repeats feels significant, and what feels significant demands attention. This is where the loop begins to sustain itself. When you're inside an overthinking loop, it feels like you're solving a problem. But if you look closely, the structure of the thoughts is different from actual problem solving. In problem solving, there is movement. You start with uncertainty, explore options, eliminate possibilities, and eventually arrive at a decision or conclusion. Overthinking does not move in that direction. It circles. The same points reappear in slightly different forms. The same questions return without resolution. You revisit details that have already been considered, and each time they feel just as urgent as before. This creates the illusion of progress. You feel active, engaged, mentally occupied. But the process is not advancing. It is maintaining itself. The key difference is subtle, but important. Problem solving reduces uncertainty. Overthinking maintains it. And because the uncertainty remains, your mind interprets that as a signal that more thinking is required. So it continues, not because more thinking will help, but because the lack of resolution is being treated as a problem in itself. This creates a feedback loop where the absence of an answer becomes the reason to keep searching, even when no new information is being generated. The system is no longer trying to solve something external. It is reacting to its own inability to stop. At the core of overthinking is a simple mechanism: prediction. Your mind is constantly trying to anticipate outcomes. It wants to know what will happen, what things mean, and how situations will unfold. This is useful when the outcome is clear or the variables are limited. But when something is ambiguous, the prediction system doesn't shut off. It intensifies. Instead of generating one possible outcome, it generates many. Each possibility is evaluated, compared, and re-evaluated. This is where the loop begins. Because ambiguity does not provide a clear endpoint, the prediction process has nothing to settle on. It keeps generating alternatives, and each alternative introduces new uncertainty. So instead of reducing the unknown, the process expands it. The more you think, the more possibilities appear, and each one feels like it needs to be considered. This creates the sense that stopping would be irresponsible, as if you're ignoring something important. but what you're actually responding to is the output of your own system. The mind is reacting to the possibilities it created, and because those possibilities feel real, the need to resolve them feels real as well, even though they are internally generated, not externally required. Emotion plays a critical role in sustaining this process. Overthinking is not just cognitive, it is driven by a specific emotional signal: tension. This tension is often subtle. It doesn't always register as anxiety in a clear way. Instead, it feels like something is unresolved, slightly off, not fully settled. That feeling becomes a trigger. Your mind interprets it as a sign that something needs attention, so it begins to search for an explanation. And when it finds one, even a weak or incomplete one, it attaches to it. Then it starts analyzing it. But because the original tension was not caused by a single clear problem, the explanation doesn't fully resolve it. The tension remains. And that remaining tension signals that the explanation was insufficient. So the mind searches again. This cycle continues. The important detail here is that the thinking is not reducing the emotion. The emotion is driving the thinking, but from the inside, it feels reversed. It feels like you're thinking in order to reduce the tension, when in reality, the tension is what keeps the thinking active. The process is self-reinforcing. Each attempt to resolve the feeling through analysis only keeps the system engaged. Another layer that makes overthinking convincing is the way importance is assigned. Not all thoughts feel equal. Some feel urgent, significant, necessary to address. Overthinking amplifies this sense of importance. The more a thought repeats, the more weight it seems to carry. Repetition becomes a signal. Your mind assumes that if something keeps coming up, it must matter. But repetition is not a reliable indicator of importance. It is often just a result of the loop itself. The system is cycling, so the same content reappears. But because it reappears, it feels reinforced. This creates a distortion where frequency is mistaken for relevance. You start to believe that you need to resolve the thought precisely because it won't go away. But its persistence is not evidence of significance. It is evidence of the loop. This misinterpretation is what keeps you engaged. You are not responding to the original situation anymore. You are responding to the repetition of the thought about the situation. The focus shifts from reality to the internal signal. And once that shift happens, the loop becomes self-contained. There is also a structural reason why overthinking does not produce satisfying conclusions. The questions it generates are often unanswerable in a definitive way. They involve interpretation, future outcomes, or other people's intentions. These are variables that cannot be fully resolved through internal analysis, but the mind treats them as if they can be. It assumes that with enough thinking, clarity will emerge, so it continues to analyze incomplete data as if it were complete. This guarantees that no final answer will feel stable. Every conclusion can be questioned. Every possibility can be reconsidered. This creates a system where certainty is always just out of reach. And because certainty is the goal, the absence of it feels like a failure that needs to be corrected. So the thinking continues, not because the problem is complex, but because the structure of the problem does not allow for closure. The mind is trying to produce a definitive answer from indeterminate inputs, and when it fails, it interprets that failure as a reason to try again. What makes this process difficult to notice is that it feels internally consistent. Each thought connects to the next in a way that makes sense. There are no obvious breaks or contradictions. This coherence gives the impression that the thinking is valid, but coherence is not the same as accuracy. A loop can be perfectly consistent and still be unproductive. The mind prioritizes consistency because it creates stability. It wants the narrative to hold together, so even when the loop is not leading anywhere, it maintains its internal logic. This prevents you from recognizing that nothing new is being added. You feel like you are exploring, but you are actually circling within a fixed set of ideas. The boundaries of the loop are invisible because everything inside it connects. There is no signal that says you've already been here. Each pass feels slightly different, even though the structure is the same. This is why it's easy to stay inside the loop longer than you expect. There is no clear point where it feels complete, and no clear signal that it should stop. The reason overthinking feels difficult to stop is not because the thoughts are too strong, but because stopping feels like a risk. When you try to disengage, there is a subtle sense that you might be missing something important, that something unresolved could lead to a negative outcome. This creates a hesitation. You stay in the loop not because it is helping, but because leaving it feels unsafe. The mind equates continued thinking with responsibility. It treats disengagement as neglect. This is a misinterpretation, but it feels convincing because the consequences are imagined as real. You are not reacting to actual danger. You are reacting to the possibility of unresolved uncertainty, and because that uncertainty was generated internally, it has no natural endpoint. So the perceived risk remains. This is what keeps the loop active, even when you recognize that it is unproductive. Awareness alone does not remove the perceived need to continue. It only shows you that you are continuing. The shift does not come from finding better answers. It comes from recognizing that the loop is not a problem-solving process. Once you see that, the role of the thoughts changes. They are no longer treated as steps toward a solution. They are seen as outputs of a system that is trying to resolve something it cannot resolve. This reduces their authority, not by suppressing them, but by changing how they are interpreted. Instead of asking what the thought means, you begin to notice that it is repeating. The repetition becomes more relevant than the content. And once repetition is recognized as the signal, the need to engage with each individual thought decreases. You are no longer pulled into the details, because you see the pattern they belong to. This does not stop the thoughts immediately, but it changes your relationship to them. They continue, but they are no longer treated as instructions. Overthinking does not end because you finally solve what you were thinking about. It ends when the system no longer treats continuation as necessary. That shift happens quietly. There is no clear moment where the loop breaks. It loses momentum when it is no longer reinforced, and reinforcement comes from treating each thought as something that needs to be addressed. When that response changes, the system has nothing to sustain it. The thoughts may still appear, but they do not connect in the same way. The chain weakens. What remains is not silence, but space. And in that space, thinking becomes optional again, not something that runs automatically to completion, but something that can begin and end without resistance. The important part is not controlling the thoughts, but removing the condition that makes them feel necessary to continue. Once that condition is no longer active, the loop no longer has a reason to exist in the way it did before. There is a specific reason overthinking tends to attach itself to certain topics and not others. It is not random. The loop forms most easily around situations where control is limited, but perceived responsibility remains high. These are moments where you feel that your interpretation, reaction, or decision could influence an outcome, but you do not have direct access to all the variables involved. This creates a tension between influence and uncertainty. Your mind attempts to bridge that gap through analysis. It treats thinking as a substitute for control. The more uncertain the situation, the more it compensates by increasing cognitive effort. But this effort does not increase actual control. It only increases the sense that you are doing something about the situation. This is why overthinking often centers around social interactions, future outcomes, or ambiguous decisions. These are areas where feedback is delayed or unclear. Without immediate confirmation, the mind cannot close the loop. So it continues to simulate scenarios in an attempt to approximate certainty. But simulation is not resolution. It is a stand-in for action when action is not available. And because the system cannot distinguish between simulated control and real control, it treats continued thinking as productive, even when it produces no change in the external situation. Another factor that sustains overthinking is the way your mind handles incomplete information. When something is partially understood, it creates a gap. That gap is not neutral. It produces a subtle cognitive pressure. Your mind interprets incomplete information as something that needs to be completed. This is not a conscious decision. It is a structural tendency. The system is oriented toward closure. So when it encounters something unresolved, it continues to return to it. Overthinking is often the result of this repeated return. The mind revisits the same fragment, trying to extract more meaning from it than it actually contains. But because the available information has not changed, each attempt leads back to the same point. The gap remains, and the presence of the gap keeps the system active. What is important here is that the mind does not easily accept partial understanding. It prefers a complete narrative, even if that narrative is speculative. So it continues to work on the fragment, attempting to expand it into something whole. This creates the illusion that more thinking will eventually fill the gap, when in reality the gap exists because the information required to fill it is not available internally. Time perception also shifts during overthinking, and this contributes to its persistence. When you are in a loop, your attention narrows. It becomes focused on the internal sequence of thoughts. External input becomes less relevant. This creates a kind of temporal compression. Minutes feel shorter because they are filled with continuous internal activity. There is no clear marker of progression. You are not moving through different states. You are cycling within one. This makes it difficult to recognize how long the loop has been running. From the inside, it feels like a continuous present moment. There is no sense of accumulation, but in reality, time is passing without any change in position. This distortion reduces your ability to disengage because there is no natural pause. In most activities, transitions create stopping points. In overthinking, there are no transitions, only variations of the same pattern. Without those breaks, the system does not naturally reset. It continues until something external interrupts it, or your attention shifts in a way that is not driven by the loop itself. This is why overthinking can feel like it lasts indefinitely, even when it is bounded in actual time. Language plays a subtle but important role in maintaining overthinking. The way thoughts are internally phrased affects how they are processed. Many overthinking loops are structured as questions. What if this happens? Why did they say that? Did I make a mistake? Questions create an open state. They imply that an answer exists and needs to be found. This keeps the system active, but not all questions are answerable in a definitive way. When a question has no clear endpoint, it becomes a generator rather than a tool. It produces more possibilities instead of resolving them. The mind continues to respond to each question with additional thoughts, which often take the form of more questions. This creates a chain where the structure itself prevents closure. If the same content were framed differently, as observations rather than questions, the loop would behave differently. Statements do not demand resolution in the same way, but the mind defaults to questioning because it is oriented toward explanation. This orientation is useful in many contexts, but in ambiguous situations, it becomes self-perpetuating. The form of the thought sustains the loop, independent of its content. What ultimately stabilizes the system is not the elimination of uncertainty, but a change in how uncertainty is processed. Overthinking treats uncertainty as something that must be resolved internally before action or disengagement is allowed. This creates a condition where thinking becomes a prerequisite for stopping. But that condition is not necessary. Uncertainty does not require internal resolution to exist safely. When this is recognized, the role of thinking shifts again. It is no longer responsible for eliminating the unknown. It becomes one of many possible responses to it. This reduces the pressure placed on the system. Instead of attempting to convert uncertainty into certainty, the mind can allow uncertainty to remain without immediate interpretation. This does not remove the tendency to think, but it removes the urgency behind it. And without urgency, the loop loses its primary driver. What remains is a system that can still generate thoughts, but does not need to sustain them indefinitely. The difference is not in the presence of thinking, but in the absence of compulsion. And that distinction is what separates a loop from a process that can begin and end on its own.